Good morning, church. So as you have undoubtedly heard by now, a couple of weeks ago, Queen Elizabeth II passed away after reigning over Britain for 70 years. And now her oldest son is King Charles III. And as many have joked, at the age of 73, he finally has a real job. Congratulations, Charles. I have found the concept of royalty to be fascinating. In most countries that still have a monarchy, they are now merely figureheads without any real power. But they're still very powerful and influential, if anything, because they're very rich. Their countries keep them around, mostly for tradition's sake at this point, and because it'd be really difficult to change. Now, nobody believes in the divine right of kings anymore, that God has placed these people on the throne, but nobody wants to take the massive effort to create a brand new government constitution unless you really have to. But what really fascinates me is the reason why Charles is king. Because he wasn't elected, there wasn't a vote, he inherited it. He's king because his mother was queen, because her father was king, because her uncle decided to abdicate in a really long scandalous story, but her grandfather was king, and so on and so forth. And I went down this genealogy rabbit hole because I wanted to know how far back the royal family went. And it is really complicated. But the short answer as to why Charles, of all people, is king is because he is the 28th generation grandson of King William I, a.k.a. William the Conqueror, who led the Norman conquest of England, defeated the Anglo-Saxons, and was crowned king in 1066. Can't you see the family resemblance? Different branches of the family, cousins have ruled since then, but all of Britain's kings and queens have been William's descendants. And all of them, including Charles soon, have been coronated in Westminster Abbey, which was brand new when King William I was coronated there 956 years ago. So lucky for Charles, right? All this is happening because he was born into the right family. And he's not the only descendant of William the Conqueror alive today. There's estimated about 5 million people with that claim, including Zenaska Mowat and her mom. And Zenaska Mowat is never going to be queen. I hate to say it, but as you know, when Charles dies, the crown will go to his son William. And the line of succession is actually really well detailed, and the lowest down on the list that I could find was her, Zenaska Mowat, who is currently 62nd in line to the throne. Her grandmother is Princess Alexandra, one of Queen Elizabeth's first cousins. Princess Alexandra, her grandfather was King George V, and when she was born, she was just 6th in line to the throne, but now she's sitting at number 56. But don't feel bad for them, though, because they are all filthy rich and living some great lives. But I have to ask, though, why is this one family so special? Because frankly, they aren't. There's nothing in their blood or genetics that makes them different or better. And considering how their family tree doesn't branch out as much as others, maybe there's a reason for that. But the reason that the Brits keep them around is because they represent Britain, both abroad and at home. Because politicians come and go. The Queen saw numerous prime ministers in her time. But the royal family represents stability and unity. Today's kings and queens, they no longer point to their own power, which has largely been stripped, but to the power of the countries and the nations that they represent. In that sense, we see similarities to family that we're going to be looking at today. And they weren't royal, but they might as well have been. And at the head was not a king, but we know him as Father Abraham. And Father Abraham had many sons. Many sons had Father Abraham. Okay, we got that out of our system. Got that out of the way. But if you know this family, if you know the Bible, you know this family. Even into the New Testament, God is referred to as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were the patriarchs, and their family was known as Israel, the chosen people of God. And today we're going to be looking at how this family got its start. Last week we started our journey through the story, a series of 31 lessons that will guide us through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, helping us to see the overarching story of the Bible, which did not end there, but which continues on to today. This isn't their story, this is our story. We began with creation and how God created a good and perfect world, but how it didn't take long for us to mess it up. The disease called sin infected the world, and as a result, the world got very ugly. Even the flood didn't fix it, because Noah and his family were carriers of that sin virus. And as frustrating as it was, though, God wasn't going to give up. But over and over again, God would continue to restore and rehabilitate the world and its people back to its former glory. God remembers Eden and is seeking to bring it back. But after that the Tower of Babel fiasco, God decided, okay, let's start small and focus on just one man and his family, growing it into a new nation. And that man's name was Abraham. When we meet him in Genesis 11, his name was still just Abram, and his wife's name was Sarai. And they lived in a city called Ur, which was likely now southern Iraq. His father, Terah, started to lead their family to Canaan, but they ended up stopping in Haran, which is now in the country of Turkey. So they made it that far north. Terah died there, and Abram probably would have been happy to live out the rest of his life there too. But in Genesis 12, he gets a message from God that it was time to keep going. Genesis 12, beginning in verse 1, we read, "The Lord had said to Abram, 'Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you.'" That passage it's a short one, but those verses are the foundation for everything else that is to come. That is the blessing of Abraham, which would be passed down from generation to generation. It was a promise from God to God's people that they would cling to tightly. It was the foundation of their identity, but it was also the foundation of their hope. Because there were going to be many times in their history, in their stories, that this blessing would seem like a far-off, distant memory. And we'll see that through the story in the weeks and months to come, especially as we look at the Exodus. But in those times, though, they would need to remember how the blessing came to them in the first place. And it was a very unlikely place. Because Abram was old. Now, people lived longer back then. His dad lived to be 205. But still, he was 75 years old. And even if that wasn't as old to them as it may be to us, no offense to anyone that's 75 and older, Abram would have been very surprised when he heard that God was going to make him into a great nation, because he and Sarai were childless. If William the Conqueror had been 75 years old and without an heir, it would have been a crisis Even more so if he and his wife needed to populate the nation of England. Why did God choose Abraham? And why didn't he do it, 50 years earlier? The answer is a recurring theme that we're going to be seeing throughout the story. God chooses unlikely people to accomplish God's purposes. God even chooses unqualified people because it's not about their strength and power. It is about God. God said, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. The emphasis was on what God was going to do. As I've said before, it's not about ability, but availability. And the blessing came to Abraham because God said, go, and Abraham went. All Abraham had to do was go and be faithful. And he did. And they all lived happily ever after. Except that's not how the story goes, is it? Abraham went, and when he got to Canaan, he experienced famine and hardship. He didn't stay long. He kept going down to Egypt, where he, Sarah, and his nephew Lot faced a number of challenges. They made some mistakes there. And all this time, he still had no children. A year passed, and then another. And then it was about 15. Abraham kept waiting, but it was getting difficult. When was God going to fulfill this promise? Where was this nation? Where was his son? In Genesis 15, we read that the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. And we're told that after this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, and he says, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me? Since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. And then the word of the Lord came to him, this man will not be your heir. Sorry, Eliezer. But a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. And he took him outside and said, look up at the sky. Count the stars, if indeed you can count them. And then he said, so shall your offspring be. And Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. And so Abraham believed for another year, and then another, and another, until it was 10. A full 25 years of waiting. He was nearly 100 years old, and still he and Sarah had no children, no family, certainly no great nation. But throughout all that time, he did not waver in his faith and his hope that God was going to do what God had promised. The New Testament reflects on this a lot. And in Romans chapter 4, we read that against all hope, Abraham in hope believed. And so became the father of many nations, just as had been said to him, so shall your offspring be. Without weakening in his faith, he faced the fact that his body was good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and that Sarah's womb was also dead. Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. I want to reread that verse 18, the first part of it. Against all hope, Abraham in hope believed. That's it. That is the story of Abraham. That's the story of Israel. And that is our story too. It is the story of faith. Abraham continued on, and so did God's story. And we know that it didn't end with him, but that one day he did have a son. He named him Isaac. He was a miracle child. The promise was fulfilled. And then a year passed, and then another, and another. When Isaac was probably around 15 years old, God tested Abraham by telling him to sacrifice his miracle child, his only heir, the only way that God's promise of a nation would ever be fulfilled. And Abraham did. Until at the last minute, God intervened and said, stop. The story would be echoed thousands of years later on the cross. But we will get there. The best commentary on that story is there in Hebrews 11, which tells us that Abraham, by faith, was willing to sacrifice Isaac because he had faith that God would raise him from the dead. And Abraham was right. That would happen, but God didn't make him go through that agony. Because God knew that God was going to have to experience that pain firsthand one day. But not Abraham. And so more years passed. Isaac had twin boys, Esau and Jacob. And they were opposites, and they fought terribly. Through an act of deception, the younger son Jacob received the birthright to that nation-building blessing that was made to his grandfather Abraham. And throughout his life, Jacob struggled and wrestled with God. Once, quite literally, he did so. And afterwards, his name was changed to Israel, which means wrestles with God, struggles with God. A name that would be given to the descendants of his 12 sons. And those sons had great conflicts among them. They struggled with God too. And in this way, his family wasn't all that different from you or from me. They weren't perfect by any means. They did things that were quite frankly wrong and sinful. They carried the sin virus just like the generations before them and after. But ultimately, throughout this story, it wasn't about them. It was about God. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob didn't point to their own greatness, power, and might, but to the faithful God that they worshiped and served. Faithfulness. That's what it's all about. This family was continually faithful to God because God was continually faithful to them. Last week, we saw that the story began in a dreadful way. But we saw how God never stopped, but kept working to redeem the world, to make it right again, because God does not give up. God would never give up on Abraham. And God pleaded with them through the hardest moments of waiting and doubt, to remain faithful to Him, to hold on to hope, and to not give up on God. Even when it didn't make sense, even when it hurt, even when they weren't sure how this was all going to unfold, they had to believe that God's story was going to end well. And that's at the heart of our story next week, with Jacob's son Joseph, who was sold as a slave in Egypt and eventually rose to be a ruler over it. But it's a story that we see throughout the Bible and beyond into our own lives as well. God is faithful to us always, even through our struggling. So the question to us is asked, as it has been asked for generations, are we faithful to God? It's not always easy, because our stories aren't always easy. There are times when God has been angry and upset, and there have been times when God's people have been angry and upset right back at Him. There is tension among us. We are Israel, struggling and wrestling with God. But like Abraham, we still go. And we keep going. We press on and we prevail. Why? Because we trust in hope against all hope. That the author of the story knows where this is all headed, that there's a point to the story, and that one day it will all make sense to us, and it will resolve in the best way possible, and that all of this waiting and struggling will be worthwhile. I'd like to end with the passage from Hebrews 11, continuing on from what we read earlier. That great Hall of Faith chapter that talks a lot about the faith of Abraham and his family. In verse 13, we read that all of these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. And people who say such things show that they're looking for a country of their own. Because if they'd been thinking about the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. But instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared a city for them. All of these people were able to faithfully live their stories because they were hoping and longing for the end of the story when God would finally make things right again, just as it was in the beginning. They kept pressing toward that better country, that beautiful country, that God's renewed and restored creation, where there would be no more struggles, no more tears, and no more pain. The stories that we live point to that coming reality and the great blessing which God is working through our lives. For this is the gospel we are preaching, and the good news we are proclaiming, not just with our words, but with our lives. We are doing so with our faithfulness. May the world see it, and may they know the loving faithfulness of our God. If you are here today and you want to know more about God's story and to help find your place in it, we would love to talk to you about it. You may not be a descendant of Abraham. I am fairly sure I am not. But because of Jesus, you can be baptized and join God's great kingdom where every single person is part of Christ's royal family. And if you are struggling, if you're even struggling with God, know that you're not alone. God has given us this community of strugglers and wrestlers, and we are here for each other. And if you are in need of prayer, if you are in need of encouragement to help keep pressing on, to keep going, we would love to pray with you. Just know that this story was not meant to be told alone, but that God has given us one another. Whatever your needs are, let us know. And in all things, church, may God and God alone receive all glory and honor and praise. Amen.